A narcissistic woman draws her sense of power from one primary source: your attention. Attention, in psychological terms, is a form of emotional currency. Every reaction you give, whether admiration, frustration, anger, or even attempts to explain yourself, feeds the dynamic that allows her to maintain control. It is not always obvious at first, because the exchange often disguises itself as love, passion, or intense emotional connection. But beneath the surface, something more strategic is taking place. Your focus becomes the mirror in which she sees her importance. When you constantly respond to her moods, her provocations, or her sudden changes in behavior, you unknowingly reinforce the belief that she occupies the center of your emotional world. For a narcissistic personality, this is essential. Validation is not simply pleasant to receive. It becomes necessary for maintaining the fragile structure of the ego. Without that steady stream of attention, the image she has carefully built begins to lose stability. This is why even negative reactions can be valuable to her. Many people believe that arguing, defending themselves, or expressing frustration is a form of resistance. In reality, those responses still confirm that she has influence over your emotions. Your anger proves she can reach you. Your explanations prove she still matters enough to justify yourself to her. But something remarkable happens when that attention disappears. When you stop reacting, stop chasing understanding, and stop investing emotional energy into the dynamic, the balance of power quietly shifts. Suddenly, the source that sustained her sense of control is no longer available. The stage goes dark, and the audience she depended on is gone. In that silence, a realization begins to emerge, one that a narcissistic personality struggles deeply to face. Her power was never truly hers. It existed only because someone else continued to provide it. And once you understand this, a profound truth becomes clear. The moment you withdraw your attention is the moment the illusion of her power begins to collapse. Once your attention begins to withdraw, something unfamiliar enters the dynamic: confusion. For a narcissistic woman, relationships often operate through patterns she has learned to rely on. These patterns may include guilt, emotional pressure, charm, sudden affection, or even calculated conflict. Over time, these tactics become predictable tools, almost like buttons she knows how to press. And for a long while, they work. When she provokes you and you respond emotionally, the pattern is confirmed. When she withdraws affection and you chase reassurance, the pattern strengthens. When she creates drama and you attempt to fix it, the structure of control becomes even more solid. In her mind, the system is reliable. Cause leads to effect. Action leads to reaction. And because of this, she develops a quiet certainty that she understands how to move you. But the moment you stop participating in that cycle, the system begins to malfunction. You no longer argue the way you once did. You no longer rush to repair tension. Her attempts to provoke guilt or emotional urgency seem to fall into empty space. From the outside, your response may appear calm, distant, or indifferent. Yet internally, something much deeper is happening. You are no longer playing the psychological role that sustained her influence. For someone who depends on control, this creates a profound sense of disorientation. The strategies that once produced predictable outcomes suddenly fail. she may repeat them again, perhaps with greater intensity, expecting the old response to return. But when it does not, uncertainty begins to replace confidence. This confusion is not simply frustration. It is the beginning of a psychological disruption. Because when manipulation stops working, it forces an uncomfortable question to the surface. Perhaps the control she believed she had was never as secure as she imagined. And in that moment of uncertainty, the balance of the relationship quietly changes. The one who understands the pattern is no longer the one who holds the power. The truth is simple, yet powerful. When you refuse to react to manipulation, you do more than protect your peace. You break the system that depended on your participation. When the usual tactics stop producing the reactions she expects, a new phase often begins. At first there was confusion, but confusion rarely remains passive. A narcissistic personality is driven by a deep need to restore the balance of control. So when she senses that your attention is slipping away, she does not simply accept it. Instead, she often intensifies her efforts to pull you back into the emotional orbit that once surrounded her. This can appear in many different forms. Sometimes it comes as sudden warmth, unexpected kindness, affection, or apologies that seem sincere on the surface. She may remind you of the moments when the relationship felt powerful, passionate, even meaningful. The goal here is simple: to awaken the emotional connection that once kept you engaged. At other times, the strategy shifts in the opposite direction. Instead of charm, there may be drama, accusations, emotional outbursts, or carefully crafted crises may emerge, designed to provoke a reaction from you. Because from her perspective, any reaction is better than silence. Anger, frustration, even disagreement, all of these still confirm that she has access to your emotional world. Psychologically, this stage reveals something important. When control weakens, the narcissistic personality often becomes more active, not less. The attempts to reconnect are not necessarily about love or reconciliation. More often, they are attempts to restore the dynamic where she once held psychological influence. But if you remain steady, if you resist the pull of both charm and conflict, something powerful begins to happen. Her strategies lose their effectiveness. The emotional hooks that once worked so easily no longer find a place to attach. And slowly, she is confronted with a reality she did not anticipate. The person she once controlled is no longer responding to the script. This is the moment when true independence begins to reveal itself, because the greatest disruption to manipulation is not confrontation. It is calm, unwavering detachment. And when you refuse to be pulled back into the game, you send a message more powerful than any argument. Your peace is no longer negotiable. At this stage, something even more unsettling begins to take place for the narcissistic personality. Up until now, there was still the possibility that you might react, that the old emotional patterns could somehow return. But when your distance becomes consistent, when your reactions no longer appear at all, a deeper wound begins to surface. And that wound lies within the narcissistic ego itself. The ego of a narcissistic individual is not built in the same way as a healthy sense of self. It is often constructed carefully over time, like a protective mask designed to hide deeper insecurity. This mask is reinforced by admiration, validation, and the constant confirmation that others are emotionally invested in them. As long as people respond, whether through love, anger, or attention, the mask remains stable. But indifference is something entirely different. Anger can be challenged. Criticism can be defended against. Arguments can be twisted and reshaped. Yet indifference offers nothing to fight with. It provides no emotional energy to manipulate, no engagement to reshape. It is simply the quiet absence of interest. And for a narcissistic personality, that absence can feel deeply threatening. When you become indifferent, you step outside the psychological arena where the narcissistic ego normally operates. Suddenly, she cannot provoke you into defending yourself. She cannot draw you into emotional debates. The reactions that once helped her maintain a sense of importance disappear. This creates a subtle but powerful shift. The inflated self-image that depended on your emotional engagement begins to crack. Not because you attacked it, but because you stopped reinforcing it. In many ways, this is the most uncomfortable experience a narcissistic ego can face. Being opposed still means being acknowledged, but being ignored suggests something far more unsettling: that the person they once influenced has emotionally moved beyond them. And when someone realizes they no longer occupy space in your emotional world, it forces them to confront a truth that no manipulation can easily escape. The lesson here is quiet, but profound. The strongest boundary you can set is not anger, not confrontation, but the calm refusal to give your energy where it is no longer deserved.
As this distance continues, another shift begins to take place, one that strikes at the very center of the narcissistic identity. A narcissistic woman often maintains a quiet sense of superiority within her relationships, not always in obvious ways, but through subtle dynamics, the belief that she holds the emotional advantage, that she can influence your reactions, that she ultimately determines the direction of connection. This sense of dominance becomes part of how she defines herself. For a long time, that belief may have felt true. If you were constantly explaining yourself, trying to keep the peace, or adjusting your behavior to avoid conflict, it reinforced the idea that she was the one in control. Your emotional investment made her position seem secure. She could step closer or pull away, create tension or offer affection, and each movement would shift your behavior. But when you begin to detach emotionally, that structure quietly begins to collapse. You are no longer seeking her approval. You are no longer reacting to every shift in mood or tone. The dynamic that once revolved around her influence begins to stabilize around something else, your own sense of clarity. And when that happens, the illusion of superiority starts to weaken. Because superiority in this context was never truly about strength. It depended on comparison. It depended on the idea that one person was emotionally above the other. The moment you stop competing for validation, that hierarchy begins to dissolve. This realization can be deeply unsettling for someone who has relied on that structure. The person who once seemed predictable, responsive, and emotionally reachable has now become independent of the game entirely. And without someone beneath them in the emotional hierarchy, the feeling of dominance loses its foundation. What emerges in its place is a simple but powerful truth. Control only exists where someone is willing to surrender their center. When you reclaim your emotional ground, the balance changes, not through confrontation, not through revenge, but through quiet independence. And that is the moment when the illusion of superiority fades, because the person who once stood above you suddenly realizes they no longer stand above anyone at all. And this brings us to the final stage of the transformation, one that many people overlook. When you truly stop caring, not as a strategy, not as a temporary reaction, but as a genuine emotional shift, something irreversible begins to happen. Your detachment becomes real, and that reality represents the greatest threat to the entire dynamic. Up until this point, there may have still been the possibility that you could be pulled back. Confusion attempts to provoke you, efforts to charm you, even challenges to your ego. These were all attempts to reopen the emotional connection. But when none of those methods succeed, the narcissistic personality begins to face something much more unsettling: permanence. The idea that you may actually be gone from the emotional game. For a narcissistic woman, influence is deeply tied to presence. As long as she can enter your thoughts, provoke your feelings, or draw you into conversation, there is still a thread connecting the two of you. But when your detachment becomes complete, that thread begins to disappear, and with it disappears the control she once believed she held. This is often the moment when the deeper fear emerges. Not the fear of conflict, not the fear of being challenged, but the fear of becoming irrelevant in the emotional world of someone she once influenced so easily. Because indifference communicates something that arguments never could. It signals that the emotional chapter has closed. From a psychological perspective, this is why true detachment is so powerful. It is not loud. It does not require revenge or dramatic confrontation. It simply removes the energy that once sustained the unhealthy dynamic. And once that energy is gone, the structure collapses on its own. What remains is your freedom, the freedom to invest your attention, your emotional energy, and your sense of self in places that nourish rather than drain you. So the final lesson is both simple and profound. The moment you stop caring about someone who thrives on controlling your attention is the moment you take your life back.